The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good day, everyone. My name is John Jackson. Welcome to another webinar in our scheduling series. Today we're going to be looking at how to review construction schedules like an expert. We're going to go through just some basics in what to look for in a construction schedule, and then just some simple techniques to apply that will really help you gain visibility into schedules. So I hope you will enjoy it. Just a couple of housekeeping. You have a download that's available on the GoToWebinar panel. I have to apologize. An email was sent out a few minutes ago with a link to the handout, and it was the wrong link. Sorry about that. So if you want to download the handout, the correct one is there on your GoToWebinar panel. We will have some time for questions. And so if you have a question, you should have a question dialog box there in your GoToWebinar panel as well. Feel free to ask questions, and we will do our best to get around to all of the questions towards the end of the presentation. Once again, thanks for attending. Let's go ahead and get started. Just one of the key components in reviewing a schedule is risk management. I tell my schedulers that report to me all the time that the scheduling process is a key component to risk management. If a schedule is responded to, is analyzed, is looked at with a good eye for identifying anomalies or issues, it's one of the best tools I know of in the construction process, in the project management process particularly, to identify certain risk. You know, there's some steps for risk management, right? These are from basic risk management processes. The first issue is to identify issues. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at today, is how to identify problems with a construction schedule so that you can assess what the potential impact is, what risks are associated with it, what the project exposure is. And once that's determined, typically you have multiple opportunities to manage that risk associated with it, and then ultimately to resolve the issues as soon as possible for the maximum benefit to the project and ultimately the project stakeholders. So risk management is a popular buzzword right now, but it is very important to understand how valuable a schedule can be in that risk management process. We're going to be talking about the critical path method of scheduling. And it's a technique, basically a technique of building a network of construction tasks or any kind of task actually associated with the construction process to give your project a good plan, get a good plan in place. And once a network is built with the individual task and then the associated relationships with those tasks, the scheduling software or the schedule itself can be calculated to determine when certain things are going to happen and the ultimate impact on the end date if activities are impacted, right? It's going to give you your best shot at projecting end dates and so forth. So the critical path method of scheduling is the most common tool used in the industry right now. So it's important to understand, if you're going to analyze, if you're going to look at a schedule, you have to really focus on the critical path of a schedule. I see a lot of different analytics run on schedules that are related to, resource loading or cost loading. There are a lot of different analytic tools you can use, earn value, so forth. But really the key in identifying issues with a schedule is learning how to really analyze that critical path, right? And ultimately, the first thing to do is validate that source document. This paragraph is from the AACEI, right? It's the protocol for looking at schedules from an analysis standpoint, and what it says is that any analysis method, no matter how reliable and meticulously implemented, can fail if the input data is flawed. In other words, you're reviewing a critical path schedule, or you're building a critical path schedule. If your critical path is unreliable, it's really not going to be a very good tool, not only for planning, but also for analyzing delays after the fact, and even for identifying issues as you're going on. So validating a construction schedule as a source document includes analyzing the validity of a critical path. And there's some basic tools that are available for that. So the ultimate goal there is to make sure a schedule has a good critical path that can be monitored, can be considered reliable through the construction process. Most construction specifications address critical path method of scheduling. I remember 30 years ago, when I started doing this, the specifications were fairly light. And so you didn't have a lot of restrictions in the specifications or requirements for the critical path method of scheduling. But now the critical path scheduling specifications are, very predominant across nearly every project of any size. But what I've learned over the years, no matter how strong your specifications are, you can have page after page of specifications. But if you don't have a good tool to help analyze the schedule or help diagnose or validate that schedule, there's really no way your schedules can, or your specifications can, guarantee schedule quality. In other words, I can put a schedule together that will meet the specs, but it may or may not accurately represent the plan for constructing the project. So it's very important to have good specifications, but it's important to really know how to look at a schedule to see if it's reliable, and that's what we're going to be looking at. The first thing I want to cover to get us off on the right path is to really understand the critical path. For years and years, I've worked with project built schedules, right? Reviewed schedules, but actually built a lot of schedules. And it's interesting when I'll work with someone, or I'm talking to someone about the project, and I'll just ask in general, what's the critical path of the project? I've heard over and over through the years, oh, everything's critical. And I always get a grin when I say that. I've heard it so many times. And I've learned to respond to that by saying, if everything is critical, then really nothing is critical. If you're treating every activity with the same intensity or the same priority, then really you're not. Then nothing's critical. So the idea of really understanding what the critical path and what you're going to be looking at when you're reviewing a schedule or taking a look at a schedule, or even looking at what's important in a schedule, you have to understand the critical path. So I've put this slide in here just so we can walk through that. You can see in this slide that I have a subgrade activity, a couple of underground utilities, electrical and plumbing, and then a slab on grade. And in between my subgrade and my slab on grade, these two utilities, my electrician needs 5 days, my plumber only needs 3. So as you can see in this chart, the underground plumbing actually has 2 days of float, right? So that's what we mean by float. You can see this visually, but how the software, how your scheduling software analyzes it, is it goes through the process of calculating. Starting in this case, it starts on day 1. If my subgrade starts on Monday morning, for example, it'll finish at the end of day on day 5. My electrician and plumber then can start on day 6, say the next week, and my electrician's going to finish on day 10, that Friday. My plumber could finish on day 8. But since my electrician's not going to finish till day 10, my slab on grade won't start till day 11. And then it will finish on day 5. That's the process of calculating what they call a forward pass. That's what a scheduling software is doing. It's counting through from beginning based on the calendars all the way up through the end of that logical sequence of those activities. And then what it'll do is calculate backwards. If it's a good scheduling package, it does what they call a backward pass. It starts at the end here on day 15 and works its way back to day 11, right? That's the late. These are called late dates. The forward pass, when it counted forward, was early dates. Counting backwards is late dates. So you can see here that if my slab on grade is going to finish on day 15, it has to start. The latest it can start is day 11. And my electrician has to finish on day 10, and so does my plumber. My plumber has a late finish date of day 10. My electrician has to start on day 10. My plumber could start on day 8, and if it only takes 3 days, could finish on day 10. So then, obviously, for my electrician to start on day 6, I need to get my subgrade done on 5, which means it needs to start on 1. Right? Then the software, just so you understand, what we saw visually, just in the graphic, what the software does, it comes in and then takes the difference in these early and late dates. And in this case, my slab on grade has 0, my electrical underground has 0, my plumber, the difference here is 2 days, right? So that's where it mathematically calculates my 2 days of float, what we could see visually, and then my subgrade has 0, right? So that's how the critical path is calculated. And so obviously in a more sophisticated schedule, you're going to have a lot of different float values. Theoretically, you have one path that has 0 float. That's what they call the longest path through that network. And then other activities have float. So it's important for this to, it's important to know, for example, how many days of float my plumber has, so that, if it doesn't show up, if my plumber doesn't show up on day 1 or the first day of its planned task, then I know as long as it shows up the second day or the third day, or the second day, I'm still okay, right? Or after utilizing those 2 days of float. Once again, in the more sophisticated schedule, those numbers are harder to just readily identify. So having those mathematical calculations and usually identifying those float values, that's easy to do in a column of a report. You can see that. I call my critical path schedule my slush fund for time. I can tell if a project's being delayed, or if an activity or a task is being delayed. I can tell how many days I have before it's actually going to impact the end date, or I can tell if it's already impacting the end date, just based on the float values of the task. So understanding that critical path is kind of a good introduction into what you want to look at. So in order for these types of schedules, the critical path method, to be used for analyzing delays, typically you're inserting a delay into this logical sequence. Like you're seeing here, you insert a delay, it shows the impact to the end date. So for that to work, you need to make sure, the first thing you want to address when you're reviewing a schedule is to validate the plan and get it in place as quick as possible. So what I mean by validating, that's a term used in the industry for actually reviewing a schedule to make sure that your critical path schedule has as few flaws as possible. There are a lot of tools you can use that. If you're using a Microsoft project, or if you're looking at a Microsoft project schedule, you can open it up in Microsoft Project, and there's a diagnostics report you can get. Same thing with Primavera schedules or Power Project schedules. There's diagnostic tools you can use for this that will just show you what the options are. I use a web tool for it. Our organization, we have projects, Microsoft Project, P6, Power Project schedules from a lot of different sources, and this is just easy for me to upload it without having to install it in or import my schedule into and opening the software. I can just upload it here. And the way this works, I just import a schedule, and once it's imported, I can select it, and then it gives me the diagnostics on this. So you can see here in this report, I can tell just based on this report, I can see issues with this particular schedule. For example, the idea of the critical path method is you have one activity that starts the process or starts the sequence. You have one activity at the very end that everything ties into. And in between those two, right, you'll have for example, you'll have a one node that starts everything off, and that branches off, and then you'll have these tied to other nodes. But ultimately, they all come down and tie into one node at the end that then through that process, you end up with one path through there that's the longest. But the way that works is if you have one starting, one going through, one path going through to that one end activity. So for that calculation to be performed correctly, you need to make sure that it's a kind of a closed network. Only one activity at the beginning, one at the end. So in this diagnostics report here, I can see that this schedule has 7 activities that don't have a relationship tie in there, right? It doesn't have successors. 2 activities that don't have predecessors. Now this is it's a very simple review technique. Like I said, you can do it in the software. There's this use Schedule Validator online to do this. But it's a very simple technique, and it's one of the first things that you should look at. Another key one you want to look at is number of constraints in a schedule. In other words, a constraint is when someone actually locks in a task to happen on a certain day instead of it being calculated by the software. So constraints can have an impact on a schedule. Now, one of the things I like about Schedule Validator, in fact, this portion of the tool is free. You can upload, I can upload schedules on here, and this free. When I click on my constraints, when I click on that constraint the little icon here, it actually gives me a narrative associated with the constraints. So I can run a report and it'll tell me the following activities contain schedule constraints, and general constraints, unless they're contractual milestones, should be replaced by appropriate logic. And so in this particular tool, you can run the diagnostics, and it will actually give you a good description, a good narrative of why certain things should be changed. So this is a great tool for just looking at the diagnostics. How reliable is that critical path method technically, right? Sometimes if there's a whole lot of float, that could be that could represent or identify issues with the logic, where maybe you're missing logic, and so that's why you have way too much float on some activities. So that's a great diagnostics tool, and it'll give you, it's something that every schedule, that's just like the basic function. Since we're talking about critical path method, you want to make sure that the critical path methodology is followed as close as possible. So that's the first thing you want to do, is just run some diagnostics, take a look at the schedule and say, hey, this needs to be cleaned up or whatever. I will typically have the schedulers in our organization that report to me, they'll copy me on a submittal, for example, and they'll ask me to review the schedule. And so one of the reasons I use the website, so I don't have to go into the software, but I quit asking them to, instead of just sending me for review, I instruct our schedulers, I want you to run that diagnostics first. So it ends up becoming a great quality control program if you get your schedulers, or if you're reviewing schedulers from a contractor, making sure that they turn in a diagnostics report with their schedule, and that just helps ensure that they've taken a look at it, and it'll just help the process. It's a great quality control, good training technique to run these diagnostics tools. a validated CPM schedule is essential to ensure a schedule can be relied upon for reliability and analysis. So once again, that's one of the first thing that you want to do. It's useless if it's not monitored properly. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing, is running good validation procedures. The next step, another good tool to use in reviewing schedules, is getting good updating procedures in place. And so you'll have a lot of different updating specs in the scheduling specification sections of contracts that will require all different kinds of things. And this one, this particular specification, they really try to restrict the changes, right? They say, hey, don't make any changes to the schedule prior to approval. And my typical response to making changes to a schedule is, if a project is changing, right, which they mostly do, most of them are changing the first day, then a plan needs to have that flexibility to change to reflect what's going on out in the field, right? So there's a fine line there between what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? If a schedule is restricted from being changed, then it will, become somewhat unreliable, because it won't be reflecting what's going on out in the field, right? But on the other hand, if there's too many changes that are made, then it may look like whoever's doing the schedule or the contractor has abandoned their work plan, right? If they're just constantly changing everything, just for lack of better planning, right? So that's the balance that you have. And in fact, this particular contract, they have one paragraph that restricts changes, but then they have another paragraph where the contractor has to certify basically that this is their current plan, right? So this is just a recent project I was working on, going back and forth between the contractor and the owner, trying to get an acceptable level of, you have to have certain changes to take place for the schedules to remain current and accurately reflect what's going on. But at the same time, you want to be able to keep some record of what the plan is. So here's a good one that, once again, this is the validator tool. I can run a quick report, select a couple of these, and look at changes that were made in a schedule. And these are, once again, there's multiple tools out there that can do this kind of thing. This one's relatively inexpensive. It's about $18 a month for these expanded reports, doing a schedule comparison. But it's a great little tool to look at what's changed in a schedule. In this case, you can see durations that were changed. You can see activities that were added and logic relationships that were changed. It makes it real easy to do it. But there's also some great tools you can use for looking at what's going on in the schedules, like comparing baseline comparisons, those kind of things. But trying to keep it simple. That's something that you kind of want to do, is be able to see what's changing in the schedule. Now, those are two more technical type of reviews, right? Those are the more technical type of reviews. Is my CPM, is my critical path method, is it being followed? Is the are the diagnostics correct? Is it there? But and then what changes are going on. This third step is probably one of the easiest to do. In fact, you don't need any software to do this step, other than maybe a spreadsheet. But it is one of the most easily identifiable analysis methods to really be able to see what's going on in a project, right? And I call it just managing milestones. Being able to have major milestones in your schedule, not necessarily contractual milestones, but taking certain milestones in your schedule and tracking them. So here's what I mean by that. I have this term I use, I call it project creep. I I talk about this in quite a bit of our training programs, because this is probably one of the number one issues that I see in my years of doing dispute resolution. This is such a frequent occurrence. And here's the idea of managing your milestones, right? Let's say we have, here's the start of the project is my A, and here is my there's my medium or my median milestone. Like that could be like pouring a slab, and then my C is my finish date. So what typically happens on a project is maybe my slab is being delayed, my contractor's falling behind, and my slab is being delayed, but I make adjustments to the schedule to still show completing on time, right? And then what happens a lot of times is that it goes too far, and the scheduler is squeezing time out of the end of the schedule to still show finishing on time, and you eventually run out of time. I've had where I really learned this lesson early on. I had when I first started working in dispute resolution, I had one of my clients call me one day, and he said, I've got a project that my project manager's been telling me we're on time, we're on time, we're on time. And finally, the owner called me today and said they don't think we're going to finish on time. I called my project manager to ask what was going on with that, and he said, first words out of his mouth were, "I quit." And so my client, the guy I was talking to, he was just in distress. But what had happened, the project was falling behind, but every month the scheduler was squeezing or borrowing time out of the end of the schedule to cover for failure in meeting their projected start and finish dates. So this next method, this managing milestones, is the kind of thing that happens. If an intermediate milestone on the critical path is slipping, but the end date doesn't slip, that means that somebody's manipulating the schedule. And this is one of the things that you really want to keep an eye on. So the question that I ask here is, what does on schedule really mean, right? When you say you're on schedule, are you saying that your end date hasn't moved, or are you saying that you are hitting the dates that you planned? For example, in my last update, we're hitting the dates that we said in our last schedule update. To me, that's what on schedule is. If a contractor is not hitting their dates on what they said they were going to do last month, then there's not a whole lot of trust or a whole lot of confidence that the contractor is going to meet what they're going to say, or what they're saying they're going to do a year from now, right? So I've learned that lesson a long time ago. So the key is, how do you track that? How do you monitor progress so that you can, when you're reviewing a schedule, so that you can see and identify these kind of things, right? So monitoring progress, the completion date is important when you're looking at a schedule. The completion date is important. Progress on the critical path, though, is what's really important to me. That's one of the main things I want to know. If they're hitting their progress on their critical path, then that end date's probably going to be in pretty good shape. But if that end date's not moving and they're not hitting their dates on the critical path, then in most cases I know my schedule is at risk, and there are some potential problems, right? Whether it's owner caused or whatever, that risk is easily identified by just looking at these three things. So I'll give you a couple exercises here. One of the things that I do each month, and I've made it a practice over the years of having the schedulers that once again report to me. I want to know those three things, right? So they'll put together a little report, a little one-page summary that says, here is our status on our end date, right? We're currently 18 days ahead of schedule in this one, right? But then that second little box there, I want to know, how did we do on the critical path last month, right? And, in this particular example, this week, the project maintained the projected progress. In other words, we hit the dates, right? And I want one of three words in there. We either maintained, we gained, or we slipped, right? And so once you do that, it will have, in this type of review, it will, if you're reviewing these things properly, it will bring about so many good benefits for your project. One of the main things that it'll do, it'll bring accountability. If you're reviewing progress on the critical path and a contractor's fallen behind or a subcontractor's fallen behind, and you bring that out in a report or in a meeting, and you say, hey, this week you lost 5 days or you lost 3 days, that accountability I have found is one of the best ways to get movement in performance. I could tell you story after story of meetings that I've sat in where a contractor is called out 2 or 3 weeks in a row for missing dates, and a contractor walks out of the room, and I've heard them pick up their phone and call their superintendent and say, hey, if you don't start giving me better dates, we're going to be in trouble. I'm not going to go into that meeting again if you're not giving me good dates. And so that kind of accountability, doing this, if you do it right, and it's simple, I'll show you here in a minute, it'll bring accountability to your project, and your planning will get better. It will help you identify issues. You know, if contractor's not meeting their dates, and you ask them, hey, what happened? Why'd you slip this? You know, last week you said you were going to pour the slab on Friday. Now it's on Wednesday. What's going on? Well, we had an RFI, right? So, we better look at that and take, get that turned around quick. So it helps in identifying issues early, and then obviously getting issues resolved early is a big part of that. And ultimately, it will help you avoid a lot of claims. So let me just show you a quick way that you can do this. This is a real simple example. I worked through this with a highway group that is reviewing schedules. And so I was talking to them about how you can, in their case, they didn't even have the scheduling software. All they were getting from a contractor was a PDF. So you can do this kind of analysis really just off of a PDF of a schedule if you don't have the scheduling software, and you can still get this is a great review process, and it's very simple to do, right? So what I do, I took, in this case, I sat down with one of the project engineers, or the resident engineer of the project, the senior project manager, and I said, let's take this project, this is a highway project, let's take this project and let's identify 4 or 5 milestones, and let's start tracking them, right? So we got out the first PDF, and we said, well, this project has a pretty clear critical path. You have to get all your submittals done before you can start work. Your first phase, you have to get in and build some detours and get all of that work done. Then you can ship traffic to phase 2. Once that's done, you ship traffic on that phase, and you do a bunch of reconstruction in the existing roadway, and then your project's done, right? So we take the first spreadsheet, and I just said, hey, identify those milestones, right? They're not, technically, they may not be milestones, but they are in reality, because they're good dates to track, and they're on the critical path. If you're doing vertical construction, right, a good milestone to put on a sheet like this, a good spreadsheet, may just be, your foundation structure would be a good one, obviously. Getting your building dried in. There's several different ones depending on the type of building you have, type of structure you have. But finding those critical milestones that are important for hitting the project completion, identify them, and then just put them on a spreadsheet. So in this case, we had here was the original schedule, and those were the dates that we put in. So later on, the contractor turns in an update. We take a look at these dates here, and the contractor slipped 90 days getting their submittals in. It took them, they cut some durations out of the phase 1, right? Brought in about 28 days, and then they cut a lot of durations out of phase 2 to get everything back on schedule. So I can tell just by looking at that on this spreadsheet of a PDF schedule that this project is, the schedule is being manipulated to still show finishing on time. When in reality, there's been either lack of production or maybe, some other types of delays, whatever it is. But that's entering into that, what I call that project creep, where you're squeezing time out of the end, and you can only do that so much. And then obviously in this last section, there, the project slipped again, right? But the scheduler kept taking time out of, or resequencing, or cutting durations to still show finishing on time. So this is a really, really simple tool, and it's probably one of the best tools that you can do, and it's simple. You don't need any software or anything. You have, if you can run the diagnostics once again to make sure that the schedule is somewhat reliable from a technical standpoint. In other words, that they're following good critical path techniques. You're kind of keeping track of the changes that are being made. Like I mentioned, that's a simple report to run. But this is the one that's going to really tell you. I'll after I fill out my spreadsheet each month, then I can go run my changes to see what they were changing to bring this back into line. So you may be a project executive and you don't have access to the software, the scheduling software that the contractor's using or whatever, but this is something you can just have a project engineer do. Hey, here's the latest submittal. Fill these dates out on my spreadsheet, right? And boom, you can get right into the details of a schedule and see when you're running into trouble. Okay, so that's a great tool, a great method for reviewing schedules, and it's so much more revealing than a lot of the non-critical path type of analytical tools. Once again, I'm using this validator tool to show you today. It actually has basically does that critical path tool for you. I can see if a project gained on the critical path this month. I can select two schedules and compare them, right? Run my little critical path analysis, and it'll show me if the end date slipped, gained, and then I can see what happened, how that project gained. I can tell in here in this particular screen where a big change occurred and the project was resequenced, right? They were pretty much tracking in within a day, and then a major resequencing brought the thing back 28 days. So that's a real simple tool. Once again, that's in the advanced reports, that $20 a month tool, Schedule Validator. That's a great tool for those kind of analytics. But really, that spreadsheet is going to be one of your best tools for keeping track of what's going on your critical path and progress in general. And then, by doing that, you're able to account for every day. In other words, what'd you say you were going to do last week or last month? What did you do last week or last month? And then what happened to make up the difference? So if I'm looking at two schedules, and for example, you can do the same thing with a look ahead schedule that's submitted. I can take last month's update, right, and see what the current critical path activity should be. And I can look at a 3-week look ahead that's done on a spreadsheet, find that activity, and I can tell if they're ahead or behind schedule for the month by doing that, just by marking up that 3-week look ahead, saying, hey, last week they said they were going to do this week it slipped 2 days, so I put a little -2 there. Little things like that. Once again, helps account for every day, and then being able to ask those questions to see what happened, what do we need to do to resolve it, and all those kind of things. And it will be a risk identifier, one of the earliest risk identifiers you can get. What happens, and you guys have probably all been there. You have you get in a situation, a contractor turns in a schedule, or someone sends you a schedule, or maybe it's one of your engineers have prepared a schedule, and you're a project executive, and they send you that schedule, and you don't even know what to look at. Right? That's one of the big challenges is I've got this PDF of this schedule. What should I really look at? Right? So a lot of times we'll just kind of skim down through what's this date, what's that date. Utilizing that spreadsheet will really help you identify this is what I need to be looking at when I'm looking at a schedule. And then I go through the process of actually, this week the contractor lost 10 days. But they resequenced 5 days for a net 5 days loss. The next month, the owner had a 15-day impact, and but the contractor then the next month pulled in another 5 days to bring it back and so forth. You can account for every day on a project. I have I go through projects all the time in dispute resolution, and I can go month to month if the schedules are validated pretty good. I can go through month to month and say, hey, this month we lost the project lost 10 days. So what was the issue? And being able to just go through and drill down into what's going on and account for every day. I want to talk just in the end here. I want to talk about some trends, but before I go there, I'd like to do a couple of polls. If you don't mind, if you wouldn't mind answering this question, which category best describes your role in construction? I just kind of want to find out who's out there: owner, contractor, consultant, subcontractor, and developer. Fill that out a little bit, and that'll kind of help me know who's in here. I'll give you a couple more seconds. And there we go. Yep. We had quite a few consultants out there, and about evenly split between contractors and owners. Let's talk about your role on your projects, right? Are you in project management? Are you doing controls, engineering, estimating? Take just a couple of minutes for these. We'll go through these fairly quickly. Very good. Yep, we have closed that out. We have about quite a few of you in project management. And let's ask about reviewing schedules. Are you directly involved in preparing or reviewing the schedules? A pretty good group there. About 85% of you are involved in that role. And then let's do one more. Have you or your organization been involved in a construction delay claim in the last year? Okay. That's looking pretty good. You guys, about half of you haven't had to deal with it. The other half of you are probably dealing with that kind of challenge. Those can be really challenging. Well, let's finish up with identifying some trends, and I'm going to once again your spreadsheet. You can do a lot of this stuff that I'm going to show you in this section on just utilizing a spreadsheet, maybe adding some charts or whatever to identify trends with your project. And it's one thing if a project slips 1 month, but if it's consistently slipping on the critical path and the end date's not moving, or maybe the end date is moving, or it's jumping back and forth, or there's constantly resequencing going on, that's just a good thing to know and see what's going on. So I've got, once again, I'm showing you this validator. I can select on this. And once again, this could be done in a spreadsheet. I select all of these and run a trends report. And this will show me my trends on, what percentage of activities are on the critical path. And so here's a trend where, about 80% and 75% of the activities are on the critical path for this particular job. I think this was a highway job. Which means if you've got that many activities, that high a percentage on the critical path, that's very high. A good percentage is, going to be, 25, 30%, right? But in some cases where a project is very linear, you'll have a higher percentage of activities on the critical path. But what that means, and this is where this is important, if I've got a high percentage of activities on the critical path, that means that project is at pretty high risk. In other words, if 75% of my activities are on that critical path, that means probably 75% of any delay that occurs is going to impact my end date. So that is at very high risk. So these are really really good trends reports. Just getting the overall. I've got, it also shows activities that are near critical path. What you can do is run those little diagnostics. Like if you want to do this on a spreadsheet, because the diagnostics part of this tool is free, you can just have someone put, the percentage of critical activities on your spreadsheet month to month, and run these trends reports on a spreadsheet. And this will identify a lot of your risk associated with your schedules. You'll be able to see a lot of variances. Here's a good diagnostic report to track. Here's what's happening to my end date, right? So once again, if you're putting that on a spreadsheet, you can run a graph that says, look how my end date is going. In this particular case, I can see, in this schedule, I had a month here where my critical path actually slipped a little bit, but in this case, the end date gained. There was a major resequencing. In fact, in this particular graph, I can see that nearly every month I was having problems meeting my critical path, but my end date would slip, and then they'd do a resequence to try to bring it all back. And so this is showing a project to me. This is showing a project because they're not hitting their dates every month, but they're doing a lot of resequencing. That's a high risk project. Sure enough, this particular project is part of a dispute resolution. And so when you see that, you can get your risk associated with your project by the percentage of activities that are critical, by tracking the critical path activities that are slipping, and utilizing your milestone report, that little spreadsheet. You can do it off of that, and then just kind of filling in your key diagnostic things in a schedule. You can get some really good trends, and it's simple to do. You can have an assistant do it or whatever, and be able to tell when projects are in trouble, right? And so that schedule validator is a great tool for doing that. I actually use that for dashboard functions as well. So the key in scheduling for success, number one, is you want to be thorough, right? It's not just enough to, I see a lot of schedule reviews where they'll just run a diagnostics, but they never really look at the critical path, right? Or they never really look at progress, like those milestone reports. They never do anything like that. They just strictly look at technical stuff, and there's really no analysis of what, if this project's going through, right? What my risk tolerances are on this project. And once again, it's very simple, but you can be very thorough and yet still keep it simple, right? And that's the big challenge. Is if you get too technical, if you're getting into things that really, a lot of the reviews that I see, they really don't tell me anything, right? Because you need to keep it simple. That's one of the things I like about those milestones. You got to make sure you're thorough and looking at the details of the schedule on a month-to-month or submittal by submittal basis, but yet then keep this analysis simple enough to where you can get good information out of it, so you can really see what's going on the project, and then remain flexible. That's one of the main things I mentioned earlier. I have projects. Our firm, we represent about half on the contractor side and about half on the owner side. And it's just amazing how we get into some scenarios, and there's no flexibility in how that schedule is going to be managed. Like I mentioned earlier, they won't let you make, maybe an owner's reviewer won't allow changes, right? And so in the construction process, flexibility is very important, within reason, to make sure that the scheduling process is going well. It's going well. So let's take a minute for some questions. Let me pull up here my question panel. If you have any questions, as I mentioned earlier, put them in in your questions in the question panel. And let me see if I can get my question panel to open up here. All right, I've got a question in here. At what point do you require a contractor to do recovery schedules? I think recovery schedules are very important. If you think about the question that, or the sample that I was showing you earlier, where a contractor is squeezing time out of the end of their job to still show finishing on time. A lot of times, an owner will request a recovery schedule, and the contractor, that's all they're doing is cutting time out of their end, and it may or may not be realistic just to show that they're finishing on time. I see a lot of project managers do that because they don't want to report to a project executive, right, that their project's falling behind. So I think recovery schedules are important, but what I recommend on that is that you do that in a session together, right? That if you're an owner, you just request to be in that meeting and take a look at it to see how realistic the recovery is. And then the other thing that on the recovery schedule from a contractor side, you want to be careful in recovering a schedule. If you recover a schedule because an owner requested, but then it's actually you're behind because of an owner caused delay, right? Then that's a different thing. That's actually acceleration as opposed to recovery. So you just want to be careful. Recovery schedules are good. It's always good to be looking at ways you can pull days out of a schedule or try to, maximize the efficiency or bring the date back in. It's best for the project. But at the same time, you just want to be careful how you manage the recovery process, right? You don't want to recover if it's, or you want to be clear if it's actually acceleration instead of recovery, right? You want to make sure you're documenting that. And then you want to make sure your recovery is realistic. Have another question here from Gabriel is, do you ever rebaseline? Typically the term rebaseline comes into play when there's been a major change order, right? That's where the contract end date is changed. That's the most common time when a quote rebaseline is done. Otherwise, everything technically is a baseline. You have your original plan as the job was bid, right? So that has the most common name for baseline. But every update, right, should be taking a look at what's happened to date, making adjustments, looking at what your plan is for the next few months or to the end of the job. And in that sense, that's all. If you make changes in there to reflect what's going on in the field, sometimes that can be a rebaseline, though it's technically the term rebaseline is when you're actually making an adjustment to a contract milestone. I avoid using terms like that may be considered, a conflict if there hasn't been a change order. But yes, I make changes to schedules all the time, and I look at it like every month is a baseline because I'm going to look at it again next month and see how I did against the previous month, right? So in that sense, it's also a baseline to measure against. But the technical term rebaseline typically has to do with if a contract was modified, and so you need to have a new baseline schedule reflecting the new contract completion dates. Okay. We got time for one more question. What do you do how do you identify when the critical path is changing? Well, once again, your milestones, you might have to look at those milestones again. Occasionally, in fact, I just was on a call the other day on a project where the phasing on a project, it was a highway project as well. The highway or the phasing had to be resequenced. Well, obviously, that's going to change that spreadsheet model you have if you have certain things that move around. So the critical path can change for a lot of different reasons. You may have a procurement item that pushes something out that now becomes on the critical path. So that's actually a very common practice. So one of the best ways to do that, once again, if you're finding that if you're doing that spreadsheet analysis, or if you're that's report on schedule validator makes it really easy to, because it's looking at the two schedules within a window. It's kind of a form of a Windows analysis, but it'll show you when your critical path changes. But that's very common for the critical path to change, and once again, that can usually be identified by just doing these simple review tools with that spreadsheet or whatever. Okay. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Once again, I appreciate you guys, girls, being in our webinar. Feel free to let me know if you have any additional question. Let me see here. I have one. If I didn't get to your question, I will respond later. Let's see here. Got a couple minutes here. How many milestones do you recommend in a schedule with a contract value of 150 to 300? This is from Robert. Once again, the main thing on your milestones is to make sure you have make sure your milestones are on the critical path, right? So, if it's a $150 million resort, right? You're a good milestone to have is going to be, starting excavation, right? That's going to be a big starting milestone once you get all of your mobilization and contracts and procurement and everything. Is, depending on if it's design, if you have your design in your schedule as well. So certain permits are great milestones to put in your spreadsheet. Start of excavation is really good. Start of foundational activities, whether you're driving piles or piers, and then obviously pouring foundational structures. And then you can do simple things. If it's a high rise, you can say, hey, we should be on the 40th floor by this date, or on the 20th floor. You can break it down you can put as many in there as you want. The more you have, the more you're going to have to identify. It's going to be more revealing. And so the key there is just to try to make sure that they're milestones that are on the critical path. Let's see what else we got. That's about it for time. If there were some other questions, there are actually a lot of questions today, so I didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but I will try to respond to each one. And I do appreciate your time. You'll get a follow-up email. And if any of you have questions or would like to discuss any of the things that we talked about today, feel free to reach out to me. I think I've got my email address right there, my phone number, and be glad to discuss any of these things with you. Once again, thank you, and I hope you have a great day.